it's my pleasure to introduce Mike Donahue and Andrew Hines, the chair of our WSPA Independent Pharmacy Academy. Thank you guys for being here this morning.
Well, thank you for having us. So let's see, Andrew, why don't you start things off?
All right, good morning, everyone. So our speaker today is Sylvia Churchill. She received her Doctorate of Pharmacy and Certificate in Health Economics and Outcomes Research from the University of Washington. Go Dogs. After 10 years of clinical pharmacy practice at Multi-Care Good Samaritan Hospital, she held a variety of roles at GlaxoSmithKline and Amgen. Sylvia currently works at Prescriptive Health, a healthcare technology company that eliminates middlemen from the prescription marketplace and empowers patients with a choice and a voice. She is also the pharmacist in charge for Boeing's employee clinics in Auburn, Renton, and Everett. So Sylvia, I'll pass it over to you now.
Great, thank you. And I see the three of us. I don't see my PowerPoint. Do you guys see my PowerPoint?
Yes, we do.
I see it.
Okay. How do I get to where, I guess maybe it will just work if I, now, how do I get it so that I can see the PowerPoint on my screen?
On the GoToWebinar panel, there's a little drop down that says Audience View. Sometimes Macs don't have those in my experience, and I'm not sure why that version of the software doesn't. So you just see the little glowing box around and you know that that's what you're presenting to everybody.
Oh, okay. Now I can see it. Great. And so, and can I go forward and back with it?
You'll still advance your slides.
Yeah, and how do I do that? Just by pushing the...
Yep, just as you always did. Remember, you had to click back on the PowerPoint screen to advance the slides.
Okay. But this is not doing it. Is this?
No, try just clicking on your PowerPoint slide and then using your right arrow, maybe.
Okay.
There it goes.
All right. Okay, let's get started. Thanks for being here, everybody. Good morning. Thanks for taking time out of your busy day to be here. This has been an incredibly strange year, and the COVID pandemic has impacted all of us in ways that we never imagined. And for the most part, that impact has been negative. But adversity can create opportunities for change, and sometimes that change can lead to a very positive impact. We see this happening in different parts of healthcare already, but for pharmacy, the opportunity is there to step up and fulfill a huge unmet need for our communities, while at the same time creating a profitable business and opening the door to pharmacy clinical services that we've been trying to open for years. So the federal government has given us pharmacists the ability to administer COVID tests and vaccinations. And the long-term implications of this are huge, because if we can do this right, pharmacies can position themselves as experts in point-of-care testing and the logical first stop for many patients before they go on to more complex care. And as long as we can establish proper reimbursement for these kinds of services, the success of the community pharmacy can stop relying so much on payment for prescription services, which is getting less and less profitable due to the PBMs and other market practices. And instead, we can start benefiting from payment for clinical services. And that is what our profession desperately needs. But of course, there are many barriers to creating a point of care testing program in the pharmacy, which is largely why many pharmacies have not jumped on board quite yet. So in this presentation, my goal is to kind of discuss some of those barriers, talk about ways that we can overcome them, and then make use of this great opportunity that we have. Okay, you see my disclosure screen?
Yes.
Yep.
It looks like it. Okay, great. So for disclosure, I am not an independent pharmacy owner myself, but I am a pharmacist. I've been a pharmacist for 25 years, and I currently work for Prescriptive Health. And as Andrew said, we're a healthcare technology company, and we're based here in Redmond, Washington. And our company has created a software platform that essentially removes the traditional PBM from the prescription marketplace. And the goal of our company is basically to disrupt the existing broken system and bring some consumerism and true market competition back in to help reshape how prescriptions are filled today. And because this is our goal, our business model works way better if independent pharmacies are successful, because we really need those pharmacies in there to compete fairly for business. And so for us to succeed, we really want independent pharmacies to succeed. So we are on your side. All right, and then although I'm not an independent pharmacy owner myself, my grandparents were both independent pharmacy owners. And this is a picture of them. They were in Belgium, and this is a pharmacy they owned for over 30 years. This picture is from 1942. My grandpa was the pharmacist, my grandma was the technician, and they were married during World War II. So they managed this pharmacy in Belgium during the occupation by the German army. It's the only picture I really have of that. And like a typical grandchild, I didn't pay enough attention when I was younger, and they'd tell me stories about their pharmacy. And of course, I totally regret that now. So for any of the younger pharmacists out there that still have parents and grandparents in the profession, take advantage of that and take time to hear their stories. All right, so let's get started by talking about the objectives of this presentation. And the first thing I want to do is make you aware of just how big the demand for community-based testing is. We're going to then identify those major hurdles that make point-of-care testing hard for a pharmacy. We're also going to discuss how pharmacists can get fair and prompt payment for testing services, and that's extremely important, especially in the independent setting. And then I'm going to get a little clinical and spend some time clarifying the different types of tests that are available and testing methods that we're seeing out there. And then I'm going to introduce you to a concept called orthogonal testing. And this is something that we can, pharmacists can use to improve the accuracy of point-of-care test results. And that is something that's going to be very important as we start using more and more point-of-care tests. And then we'll finish that off by outlining steps to developing a profitable testing program in your pharmacy. And let me expand a little bit on that, on why we're going to do that at the end. So at Prescriptive, another feature of our blockchain technology is that it can provide the ability to communicate with patients in a secure and HIPAA-compliant way through their mobile phone. And so when COVID hit, we, along with this huge demand for testing, we realized that we could use this technology to help pharmacies to provide this much needed testing. And we're hoping that by taking care of some of the major challenges that would prevent a pharmacy from doing testing today, that we can, what I'd like to see is a national movement where pharmacies become known as the place to, where patients who are assumingly healthy and asymptomatic, where they come to get COVID testing in their community. And yes, I said healthy and asymptomatic people. So we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So as a company, we've spent the summer preparing and working on this. We've worked very closely with the Washington State Pharmacy Association. We were able to develop some good training materials with the help of them and a couple of great faculty at the University of Washington and Washington State University Pharmacy Schools. Shout out to Jenny Arnold, Jenny Bocci, and Julie Akers for all of that help. And this fall, I was able to sit on a state testing task force. It was basically a partnership between public and private sector companies to brainstorm on how we could best expand testing capacity in Washington State with more providers and more locations. And that's basically what brought me here today with this presentation. All right, so let's start by identifying just how big the demand for testing is and will be for the foreseeable future. Since the pandemic began in March, the supply of tests has really not been enough to meet demand. So almost all testing that has happened has been reserved for people who suspect that they are sick because they either have symptoms or they've had recent exposure or suspected exposure to COVID. But as the supply of these tests increases, and that is finally starting to happen, it's been a very long, slow process, but we are starting to see that that supply of tests is increasing. And once that happens, there is a whole other market for testing that is huge. And it's the testing of people who believe they are healthy and they have no symptoms, but they need to verify that they're not infectious for a variety of different reasons. And here on the slide lists several examples, and I'll highlight just a couple of them. So when we look at employers, we can't have employers testing all employees all the time, but there are some specific areas where it could be very helpful. I'm thinking about some manufacturing plants where employees have to work in close proximity together. They can't avoid that. And so being able to make sure that they're not infectious would be very important. Agricultural workers in Eastern Washington, that is a great example where these employees often live in group housing. They are transported to the fields in group transportation. And they really struggled this summer with COVID. And primarily because there was not adequate testing to really ensure their safety. And then another example for employers would be like Boeing. So if you have employees that are required to do international travel as part of their business, as part of their everyday work, we need to be able to test those people before they get on a plane and go to another country. And that's getting really big too. We've seen that some schools and universities have been able to resume classes and doing so by having routine testing to hopefully identify and contain any outbreaks. It's been somewhat successful with some problems, of course, but some schools have been able to do it. And amazingly enough, we are watching sports again, football, baseball, soccer. And the way they're doing that is because these players are basically living in bubbles and they're being tested every day to every 3 days. And as the test supplies continue to increase, we're going to continue to see these types of programs. There's something called situational testing, and that really refers to any situation where a person feels fine, but they really want to make sure that they're not infected so that they don't unknowingly infect a high-risk individual. And there's lots of examples for that. My daughter's pregnant, and we know that pregnancy, being pregnant with COVID would not be a good thing. So if I was going to go spend time with her right now, I would love to be able to take a test before spending time with her to make sure that I don't inadvertently infect her. If you have an elderly grandparent that you need to take care of, another reason to want to be able to test before you go in there. If you need to attend a funeral or a wedding or any kind of event where people congregate. And again, this is something that with limited testing that would not happen, but but once there is enough tests, this is something that can happen. Oh, and then the big one. So here's the big one that I think is really going to make a difference is for travelers. And this is just starting to ramp up, and it's going to be a huge demand. And it's an area where I think pharmacists would be very well suited. And this is, so for example, the state of Hawaii, Alaska, and New York right now, they require anyone who wants to fly into their state to show proof of a negative PCR test within 72 hours of their flight into that state. And if they can't prove that they have a negative test result, then they need to quarantine for 2 weeks. So Hawaii just started this program. October 15th was the first day that they did that. And I kind of watched to see how it went. And that very first day, over 10,000 people flew into Hawaii. And that means 10,000 people needed to get a test just for that day's travel in one state. So you can imagine how big it will be as these kind of test requirements go up. And as long as we're talking about numbers, let's really try to quantify the demand that we're talking here. So there are over 320 million people in the United States. In the state of Washington alone, we have 7.8 million people. And just about every one of us can think of at least one personal situation in which we would want to have a test done. So if everyone had just one test, that's 7.8 million people in Washington alone. And truth be told, I think most people will need more than one test. It's going to be a repeat thing. So someone needs to fulfill this huge demand, and it's really an amazing opportunity for pharmacists, primarily because these are voluntary elective reasons to test, and people are willing to pay cash for this. These types of testing may not always be covered by insurance because they're not medically necessary, but a consumer would be willing to pay for it because they want those things done. And we're seeing this. The big pharmacy chains are gearing up to provide testing for employers and become trusted testing partners for the states. But we don't want to let them have all of the opportunity here. It is vital that independent pharmacies be included in this. And this is especially true in rural areas. So according to some NCPA data that I read, there are over 15,000 zip codes in the United States. And out of those, 3,000 of them, or 20% of all zip codes, the only pharmacy in that zip code is an independently owned pharmacy. So there's no CVS, there's no Walgreens. They're depending on their independent pharmacy to help them out. So it is crucial for independent pharmacies to be included in COVID-19 testing to be able to provide access to these areas. All right, quickly, I want to tell you about this great webinar I attended a couple of months ago that was sponsored by NCPA, and it was a webinar presented by pharmacist Ann Pace of Kavanaugh Pharmacy in Little Rock, Arkansas. And she was lucky enough that when the Quidel antigen tests received their EUA back in May, she immediately put an order in and was able to get that. A lot of people were not that lucky. So she ordered 1,500 tests, and by the time she did this presentation in, I think it was August, she'd already done over 1,000 tests. So she shared her story and her best practices with us, and I found it so incredibly inspiring and really a validation of why pharmacists should be doing this type of testing. So I encourage you to spend an hour listening to her story. The link to the webinar is on my screen there, or on my slide. But I'm going to share a few highlights here just to give you an idea of what testing looks like. So Kavanaugh Pharmacy, it's a 65-year-old independent pharmacy. They'd had some prior experience with testing, point of care flu testing and strep testing, and they had a BD Veritor machine for reading the results already. When COVID hit, they were very busy with all of the same type of issues that I heard from you guys during the town halls. Issues with staffing, scarcity of PPE, the ability to mail prescriptions out, provide 90-day supply and early refills, concerns about a badly timed PBM audit, and so on. But eventually things started to ease up for the pharmacy, and they felt that they really had the bandwidth to provide some of this much needed testing services for their community. When they were deciding, there was two point of care antigen tests available, the Quidel Sofia 2 and the BD Veritor. And even though she already had a BD Veritor machine, she actually opted to go with the Quidel Sofia 2, and for a couple of reasons. One, that test was just a little bit less expensive than the BD tests. But most importantly, the BD test required refrigeration. So it's a good thing that she noticed that, because having to store 1,500 tests in one refrigerated spot could be a hurdle. So at any rate, that's why she went with the Sofia 2. So how did she do this? First of all, when you're setting up testing, you've got a few options. Do you want to test people in the pharmacy, outside of the pharmacy? Do you want to set it up through your drive-through or in your parking lot? With COVID testing, pharmacies have the opportunity to go on site somewhere if they want to do that testing, or to set up a completely separate testing site if they need to. What Kavanaugh Pharmacy did is they created in their parking lot 4 designated stalls where patients would pull in, call the pharmacy, let them know they were there. The pharmacist would come out. The patient would pull, they'd keep their mask on, but they'd pull it down underneath their nose, roll down the window, and the pharmacist would come in and do the nasal specimen collection. Roll up the window, put the mask back up, and then the pharmacist would take that specimen and hand it to the technician to run it through the machine. So doing it with as little hand-to-hand interaction as possible. As far as costs, well, first of all, I'll quickly talk about PPE. So she used an N95 mask and a face shield, gloves, and a gown, and she changed those gloves in between every patient, and she sprayed herself down with 70% alcohol between every patient as well. If you're observing a patient do a specimen collection as opposed to doing the specimen collection yourself, that allows you to keep more than 6 feet away, so that the PPE needs go down a bit in those situations. The costs to them to set up for testing, of course, we've got to think about PPE and potentially extra staffing needs. They found that they had to add 3 extra phone lines. They had to buy biohazard bags and disposal boxes, and they struggled with scheduling an advanced appointment, so they had to purchase a scheduling platform to take care of that. For communicating the results, they picked up the phone and called the patients, trying to do it within an hour of when they had the test done. And then if it was a positive result, the pharmacists themselves would do the actual calling so that they could counsel and all of that good stuff. The payment, what they did is they charged $95 per test, all cash, no billing. They accepted credit cards, HSA cards, and FSA debit cards. And they did provide a receipt for the patient to submit for reimbursement to the insurance company for reimbursement. So by doing all cash, that was guaranteed payment. So that was really a great thing for them. As far as marketing, she actually said that she did not have to do much marketing at all. They put 1 Facebook post on their company Facebook site, and then it was just word of mouth, and interest exploded. She said that website traffic increased 8,000%. They had to add those phone lines, lots of phone calls. And what she's doing now is actually hiring an LPN for extra staff as an extra person to test. So yeah, just a very, very cool experience for her. Oh, and I didn't mention competition. So most in her community, most of the people were only offering PCR tests, and at that time the turnaround was terrible. So people were very excited to be getting a rapid test where they can get immediate results. There was a doctor across town that was offering antigen testing, but he was charging for an office visit first and then $300 for that test. So Kavanaugh Pharmacy was a much better deal. And thinking about her experience, we can see that there's several challenges to really setting up point of care testing in the pharmacy. Scheduling is the first one I'll mention, because this is not something that people can walk in and do. The pharmacy could get inundated, and you really have to be able to balance that with the regular pharmacy work that's going on. So very important to require online or to require advanced appointments. And it was very difficult for her to do manually, so she ended up getting an online scheduling system. The way she did it as far as numbers of tests, she was able to do, when they first started, 1 test every 15 minutes, and she would do that for 8 hours a day. So 4 tests an hour, 8 hours a day, 32 tests a day. And then she really, started becoming more efficient and ramping up, and was able to do 3 tests every 15 minutes. And so that's 12 tests an hour. And so she cut down to 3 hours of testing a day and was still able to get 36 tests a day in. So very easy for her to ramp up and get a good number of tests in. Another hurdle is screening and doing all of the data collection that's required for COVID testing. It's not as simple as most of them, as like the influenza test, because there is so much data that the public health department requires. I think it's at least 25 different data elements that need to be asked on top of everything else. So you need a really clear way to collect the data and preferably not in person with paper and pen, because you want to minimize the passing back and forth of paperwork and pens. And it also becomes very time consuming when you're doing that, and you're exposing yourself to the other person for a longer period of time, which you want to minimize. So ideally, you would be able to collect this information electronically prior to the actual appointment. But what's hard is that this has to be done in a very secure and HIPAA compliant manner. Another hurdle is communicating results, because she was picking up the phone and calling people, and if they don't answer and you end up with a bunch of back and forth screen tag, just check something here, that can really take up a lot of time and effort, and it's also frustrating for the consumer who wants to get their test results. Yeah, so she had a lot of phone tag going on. And then the last hurdle I'm going to talk about here is public health reporting. And this is, as I said, very complex with COVID testing. And every test needs to be reported. Every result needs to be recorded. And there are financial penalties for failing to do so. They will fine you $1,000 the first day and $500 for each additional day of non-compliance with reporting results. There's a few ways to do it, but none of them are simple, and none of them are very easy for a pharmacist to do. Andrew Hines and I were both on one of the testing task forces for the state on how we can try to improve this. We've made some suggestions, and hopefully it'll get easier for a pharmacist. But what a lot of pharmacists have to do is manually fax the reports into the Department of Public Health, and that's just not efficient for anybody involved, because even for the Department of Public Health, once they get that fax, they have to go through and manually take what they're reading, which can be hard to read, and manually input it themselves as well. So another big hurdle. Okay, and so I've identified some of the major challenges to setting up point of care testing, and those were the same barriers that we identified at Prescriptive Health. So these are the hurdles that we're working on to help you overcome. So for scheduling appointments, we have an electronic system where the patient can use their mobile phone to register, choose a pharmacy, schedule an appointment, and then answer all of those screening and data questions that are required. And that is all done through a secure and HIPAA compliant platform. So very helpful there. And then for communicating results, because of our ability to communicate with patients directly through the mobile phone, we've created testing reports that are sent to the patient securely through their phone, and it's a result that they will have on their cell phone that's verifiable, and that they can show to whatever entities need to see that to be able to do whatever they need to do, whether it's school, employment, or travel. All right, let's talk a little bit about payment, because that is very important, that we get fair and prompt payment for testing services. You're not going to do this if you don't know, will I get paid? How much time and paperwork is required to get paid? And will my payment be enough to cover my costs? We know that medical billing is an option, but that takes time, it takes money, it takes patience. I'm not an expert in that, so I'm not going to focus too much on it, but there are options there. But what we have seen with this demand of testing, and especially this testing by asymptomatic people, is that cash payments are working very well. Let's see, at Kavanaugh Pharmacy, I think she said they did 1,000 tests. So they ran out of tests so quickly because the demand was so high, and no one had any problem paying $95 cash. One thing that they had an issue with is they collected the payment when the patient arrived for their test. And unfortunately, what would happen then is if a patient no-showed, then you wouldn't get paid, and you're also wasting a spot where someone else could potentially have gotten a test. So a better option would be to be able to collect that payment at the time that they schedule the test. And that is something that Prescriptive is built into the technology as well, so that you don't lose out on that potential income. All right, let's switch gears here and get a little clinical, because we're pharmacists, and talk a little bit about the different types of testing methods, just to make sure that we're clear on what's available out there. So there's diagnostic testing. That's the testing that we've mostly seen, and it's been going on since the onset. And that's where you are identifying current infections in people who have symptoms or suspect or know that they were exposed to someone with COVID-19. That's different from screening testing, where the patient is typically asymptomatic, has no known exposure, and they're doing it to make sure that they're healthy, so that they do not inadvertently transmit COVID to someone who might be high risk. And we talked about all those different scenarios where that might happen. And then lastly, there's surveillance testing, and that's something that's typically done by researchers and public health departments. In that kind of testing, the patient typically does not get the result of whatever test was done, and it's done more on a de-identified level to get population information, not individual information. So the top two types of testing are really what pharmacies can be doing, and the screening testing is where I think pharmacists are perfectly suited. First of all, because you're dealing with asymptomatic people. You really don't want people who think they're symptomatic or sick in or near your store, or it's a concern to your staff, it's a concern to your customers. So you'd much prefer to be able to screen people who are asymptomatic and basically just trying to prove that they are not infected. And by doing so, this can be done typically with a little less PPE. Pharmacies can choose between doing the specimen collection themselves or watching the patient collect the specimen under their observation. And more recently, we are seeing an increased demand for situational screening. And we've talked about all of those situations, travel, et cetera.
Sylvia, there was one question in regards to the Kavanaugh experience you talked about. Did you know how many reporting elements they had to submit to their Department of Health or public health officials, and how they resolved those issues?
Yeah, so at Kavanaugh Pharmacy, so the CDC requires about 25 different data elements to be reported. A lot of stuff on ethnicity and race, and whether they were symptomatic, whether they had exposure, how long they were symptomatic, all of that kind of stuff. And that's pretty common. That's the same data elements that are required across the country. The hard thing is that every state, many states, decide that they want to get just something a little bit different. And so they'll add one or two things to the required data elements. And I don't think that they fully realize how hard that makes it for other people, especially for us, because we're trying to take care of all states, and with every state being a little bit different and every state having a different method they want you to submit the information, it does become very challenging. And what Kavanaugh Pharmacy did, as I mentioned at first, it was just a manual Excel spreadsheet that they physically faxed in to the Department of Health, and she found that to be so burdensome that she then I think she went to a company called Pioneer that helped her create a better testing report, but I believe it was still being faxed in every day. Okay, and if you have if you want more detail on that, just let us know. Okay, you're going to get this stuff. You guys probably already know this stuff, and if not, you'll be getting it in other sessions, but I'm quickly going to summarize the different types of tests that are out there. Two main things that you're doing. You've got a test to diagnose current infection, and then you've got tests that diagnose previous infection. So here on this screen are the tests that diagnose current infection, and basically it's looking for the presence of virus in the respiratory secretions. So whether you're doing a PCR or an antigen test, it's going to be a respiratory specimen that you collect. The main differences between the two is that the PCR test detects virus DNA, and it tends to be more sensitive than antigen testing because it's taken to the complex lab and a bunch of stuff is done to it to make it much more sensitive. But the bad side of that is that it requires that complex lab, so it's going to be a more expensive test. And as we have very, very much seen, you have a longer turnaround time to results. Now, the antigen test is looking for proteins of the virus, so quite similar, and it's again in the respiratory secretions. It's not quite as sensitive, but the big benefit with antigen tests is that they can be performed at the point of care, and most importantly, the patients can get results very quickly. The results available within 15 minutes, but not all. Setting it up with the pharmacy, you wouldn't necessarily have everyone waiting for that result. It would slow down your efficiency, basically. And what's really, really important for everyone to realize is that when you're doing a diagnostic test with either a PCR or an antigen test, the result is only telling you if you were positive or negative at the time that you had that specimen collected. So you could have had a negative diagnostic test today and then become infectious and have a positive diagnostic test tomorrow. So even if you have a negative test, you still need to mask, you still need to social distance, and take all of those standard precautions. Okay, and serology tests or antibody tests, these are the types of tests that detect antibodies to the virus, and that would indicate that the person has had a previous infection. Antibodies live in the blood, so for this one, it's a blood specimen, and almost all of the antibody tests that are available now are only available through the complex labs using a venous blood draw. There is one point of care antibody test that has an EUA right now, and for that one you can use finger stick blood, and so that would be, the ideal test to do in the pharmacy. And it's important to note that it takes time for antibodies to build up when a person is infected. So really you want to wait until at least 2 or 3 weeks after you suspect that you had the infection before you would test for antibodies to allow those levels to rise. And there is a risk of false positives with these antibody tests, and that's primarily because it's testing for proteins to coronavirus and to antibodies to coronaviruses. And there are more than just the COVID-19 coronaviruses. There's actually a couple of coronaviruses that contribute to the common cold. So if a person has recently had one of those common cold coronaviruses, an antibody test could accidentally detect that instead and give you what would be a false positive. And all of this is kind of, moot for now because right now there's not a good reason to use an antibody test. We still really need to be able to determine what a positive antibody test would mean. If you have antibodies, are you immune? How long would you be immune? Does it mean that you don't need to be screened at least? And how long would that be? There's still a lot of questions that need to be answered in that area. So for right now, the majority of testing is the diagnostic testing with either PCR or antigen. I had mentioned that, boy, we're getting short on time, so I'm going to go fast here. I really like this slide because if we're doing point of care antigen testing and the people in the big labs are saying those tests are no good, they're not as sensitive as the PCR tests, we do have an argument against that, and that's basically that sometimes you could be too sensitive. And what this slide shows is the red line, that's the viral load in the body through the course of infection. So you can see it goes up, and then as your immune system starts to kick in, the viral load goes down, but then it stays at a certain level for a long time. And some people have these viral genetic particles in their bloodstream for months after the infection, but they are not infectious at that point. In fact, they have not seen anyone that's infectious with the disease more than 7 days past onset of symptoms. So for that reason, and that's the reason that they say that if you've been positive, you just need to quarantine for 10 days, and then they feel pretty assured that you're clear to go back to work. But if you look at this slide, the antigen test, which is less sensitive, it won't test until the levels are higher, so you can see that. And the PCR test, it's much lower, but what you notice is it's so low that even after 9 days, when your viral load is so small that you're no longer contagious, but you still have viral particles in the respiratory specimens or secretions, the PCR test can continue to test positive, and even though you're no longer infectious. And so that can actually be a problem because you're not infectious, and it could potentially keep you from ever getting back out in the community. So I just really like this slide because it makes that argument for people. And it's very, very important that people understand just how accurate the test result is. And that is not dependent on just the sensitivity and the specificity of the test. We hear about those terms a lot, but a lot goes into the accuracy of a test result. Number one being the quality of the specimen collection. So if we can't get a quality specimen collection, we're not going to get a good result. And that's one of the reasons where I think pharmacists are very important candidates for doing this, because we can be well trained at this. We understand aseptic technique. We follow directions very, very well. So we're prime candidates to do a quality specimen collection. You also have to think about when you do that specimen collection, the timing of that in relation to your course of infection. If you try to get it too soon before the viral load has gone up, you're going to falsely be negative. Or if you get it too late after your body's already immune system has kicked in and your viral load has gone down, you're going to miss it again. You also have to think about the prevalence of disease in the community, because if there's a high prevalence of disease in the community, you're more likely to be able to have a positive result that is a true positive result. So that needs to be considered. And of course, you look at the patient's clinical and epidemiological history, symptoms, and exposure. And then finally, you look at the test performance, how sensitive and specific it is, and did you follow the instructions for use for that particular test? Because they're finding that a lot of the false positives that we're hearing about with these antigen tests are due primarily to just not following the directions correctly for processing the test. So because the accuracy of the test is impacted by so many different variables, really each test result needs to be interpreted by a trained healthcare professional that can really critically evaluate all of these things and give a true estimation of the level of certainty that this test is accurate. And then you can determine, do we need to follow this up with a second test to confirm or deny what we found with this test? So again, these are things that require some skill, some finesse, and a little clinical knowledge. And that's one of the main reasons why pharmacists should be doing this. And orthogonal testing, I wanted to introduce to you. We won't go into big detail, but this information that you see here is on the CDC website, and the calculator on the bottom is on the FDA website. And it's basically showing that even if you have tests that don't have fantastic sensitivity or specificity, if you can do a test and if you aren't too certain about the result and then follow it up with a second test, that immediately greatly improves your probability of the test results being accurate. So for example, just on that calculator on the bottom, if you took 2 tests that you were going to do, you input their sensitivities and specificities, and you also input the prevalence of the disease, because that all impacts it. If you did just 1 test, your positive predictive value is 42%, which means less than half of your results are really, you can count on being accurate. If you do a second test, that test also not super great you're going to have a 53% positive predictive value. But by doing those tests one after the other in sequence, your positive predictive value then becomes much higher at 94.3%. So if pharmacists can learn and understand this and kind of figure out when and where orthogonal testing can be used, I think it can really improve the accuracy of results and the ability to really make appropriate actions based on test results. Okay, and this is my last slide. So basically just a quick summary that to prepare for a profitable testing program in your pharmacy, you do have a lot of things you need to think about, a lot of barriers you need to overcome. But our prescriptive technology that we're working on it's got a HIPAA compliant platform that can really solve for a lot of those hurdles for you guys. We've got the solution for scheduling, data collection, reporting to patients and public health, and the billing process. And also just having the consumer being able to conveniently use their cell phone to find a pharmacy, schedule a test, answer all of the questions, and then get their results on their cell phone that they have to show from there on out. Just very, very well liked. We are getting requests from all sorts of people for the ability to do this. Large and small employers. We've talked to colleges and universities. Like I said, the big area is in the travel industry, so airports and airlines. And we're working with state governments as well. So there's just a lot of opportunity here. Things are really building up. But what we need now is we need the pharmacies to be there to fulfill all of these requests. So I highly encourage you guys to put some good thought into this and see if this is something that you can do in your pharmacy. All right, we are very close to the end, and I apologize for taking so long, but I would like to open it up to questions.
Well, I'll have one just to start things off. If someone's in a situation where they get a positive PCR test, but they were never symptomatic, and they're thinking, am I one of these people that the viral load has dropped way down so that I'm really not contagious anymore, and I want to be able to fly to Hawaii, or I want to be able to not miss work. Is it advisable to get an antigen test right away, just to verify that, and maybe even follow it up with a serological test to see if we've got antibodies or not? Would it make any difference?
Yeah, well, so originally what the CDC was recommending, if you were positive with a PCR test, they would basically say you need to quarantine until you can test negative for a PCR test twice within 48 hours. And from the slide that I showed you, which is probably what prompted this question, if you use that PCR test, you could continue to test positive for a long time. So yeah, that is something that needs to be taken into consideration, and where it may be wise to take an antigen test that is more likely to detect if you're infectious as opposed to if you have viral particles floating around in your specimen. And then as far as antibody testing, I do think that there's a place for that coming up. But we're really waiting for the CDC to finish their research enough that they can give us some really good guidance on what it means. But if it does show that you can, if you're antibody positive, if that can show that you're immune to either infecting other people or to getting another infection for X number of months, that can be very helpful as well. So we're looking forward to that information. And there are definitely more antibody tests in development for point of care. So hopefully that'll all happen at about the same time.
Yeah, and I want to remind people that they can use the question box, or if you're on the app, you can hit the little question mark to be able to type in a question, or the raise your hand function, and I can unmute you. Sylvia, thank you for that presentation and highlighting some different gems in practice. I also want to throw out a plug that WSPA has been partnering with to support testing across our state and get that up and going. Meeting with Sylvia and different owners and trying to support that. We're working on partnering with the state to be able to roll out more testing. And so please do reach out to me if you'd like to, at your independent pharmacy, host testing potentially. That we're working on trying to address the software and reporting issues and make that streamlined and have a couple of different solutions we're trying to piece together for that. So go ahead and reach out with me. Scott, you have a question. You were asking, these tests are currently available to purchase, and how much does a test cost? Scott, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Were you meaning the antibody test or PCR or the point of care test? So give me just a moment. I'm finding you. Okay, Scott, you're unmuted, but you're still muted yourself. Scott, are you able to unmute yourself and clarify your question?
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, my question was regarding the antibody, kind of the point of care testing.
Okay.
I'm sorry, the antigen, not antibody, antigen.
Okay, yeah. So antigen tests, there are now 7 antigen tests, and 6 of the 7 are point of care tests. So 6 options. And actually one of them, the Quidel, they've got a test for just COVID, the SARS virus, but they also have now a multiplex test where one test using one specimen can test for COVID plus flu together. So especially this time of year, that's really important. Can you get them right now? Today, it's still very difficult to get them. I know some people are getting them, but it's kind of hit and miss. And primarily that's because when these tests got their EUA, so they don't have approvals yet, they have emergency use authorizations, which is an EUA. And honestly, I mean, within hours of each one of these antigen tests getting an EUA, the federal government came in and said, this is so great, we're going to buy every one of these tests. And so, for example, the most recent one, the Abbott Binax Now test, that one is a good one because you don't need to buy a machine like the Sophia 2 or the BD Veritor to use. It's just a cartridge and you read it visually. So we were all excited. It's like, this is the best test to use in the pharmacy. And within 2 hours of the EUA being announced, Trump made a press release and said that the federal government is buying 750 million of those tests. So unfortunately, the first 750 million tests that company can make are already called for. So that's kind of what's been happening and why it's been so hard to get them. But it is starting to open up, and I have good reason. I've heard a lot of people say that within the next couple of months, the supply of tests is really going to start catching up with demand to the point that we can start expanding. And instead of just testing symptomatic people, we can expand to this asymptomatic and profitable avenue for testing.
And Carrie, yeah, you've been diving into this and working on switching over from HHS testing to testing at your site. What have you found?
So I have found that at least currently the BD Veritor Plus system is actually readily available. You can get the analyzer machine for approximately $350, and the our wholesaler, we had to go through their med surge side, but does have access to the SARS-CoV tests, and they at this point run approximately $40 a piece for the tests. So we will likely, we have done, at my locations, we have done through September over 2,000 of the HHS PCR tests. We will be offering this in addition likely to that, because there are definitely places, travel and such like that does require the PCR most often. So that is, I mean, honestly, the majority of the testing that we have been doing, you know, and we started the first week of June, has, you know, most of it has been return to work. There, we have schools in our area that are in person private schools, and they are requiring, negative tests. And then we've done a ton of travel tests. So, and these antigen tests likely will not be enough for qualification, though, for the travel and such. Back to school and stuff like that, likely, but most of the states have very strict requirements as to what they require.
And then Carrie, while I have you on, you've just started doing, getting set up to do medical billing for these tests also, so that patients with their medical insurance, you can go ahead and offer the testing for them also, correct?
We did just get our prescriptive authority, or no, provider status, and a contract through First Choice. We're diving into that as we speak, trying to figure out what the billing for that looks like. So yes, TBD.
A shameless plug for our medical billing group that meets the third Tuesday of the month to help support each other in getting up for medical billing for all services, not just COVID vaccine. But again, put in a plug to email me to be added on if you want the invite to that call. It's open to everybody to join on if you're interested in medical billing and getting that up and going. And thanks, Dawn, for that question. What other questions do people have? Andrew, anything from your end? I know that you guys have been looking at doing testing at a site. Any other details that you've kind of come up with and been putting in place?
I think I know in Eatonville, my dad has worked very closely with the Pierce County Health Department and partnering with them to be able to offer testing for patients that might not be able to afford it, or to just kind of help get more testing into the community. So Dawn, kind of to follow on to your question as well, I would say, potentially referring people to their local health jurisdiction to find, I know they get a lot of grants or free resources where they're able to offer those testing at, kind of specific random locations at random times. But if it is something that they aren't able to afford, and the pharmacy is not set up to do any sort of billing, looking to the health departments for accessing some of those free services for testing could also be a resource that I know in Eatonville, with the ruralness of that location, that's something that we've been investigating.
Great.
Let's see. Yeah, I see there's a question from Rod Schaefer. How does one get a hold of prescriptive health? And I assume that's by just contacting WWW.
Yep. So my email, I think I have my email somewhere.
I posted the link to their website.
Yes.
As well.
It's www.prescriptive.com, and the main thing is in prescriptive, it's CRYPT instead of IPT, and that's just a play because we have secure cryptic blockchain technology. But yeah, if you go to www.prescriptive.com, we've got some information on the website. It does need to be a little bit updated because we started this focusing 100% on employers and basically contracting with employers. We're still doing that, but we're also finding that direct to consumer is a very big market. So we're focusing on that as well. And that's where it becomes easier for an independent pharmacist to kind of do their own thing. But we can certainly provide patients to you guys through the employers as well.
I saw one other question here from Don Downing. What resources are available to pharmacies who have patients with insurance but can't afford to pay cash for tests?
Yes, it's very important that we cover those, and especially if you're symptomatic, those tests will continue to be offered for free and fully covered by area hospitals, public health departments. You could offer to do those in your pharmacy as well. And what you can do if like say you want to do the direct to consumer cash profit making testing for part of the week, but maybe set aside a day or two a week where you're doing testing for the Department of Health and basically doing it on a voluntary basis to help the community, that's available as well. But there are places for people to go to get those free tests. And certainly you can offer that, but knowing that an independent pharmacy is a business that needs to stay viable, it's great that now we've got an option that has that will take cash and that there is a huge demand for.
Okay, and I see one other question from Deanne Bell. How exactly did Kavanaugh Pharmacy overcome the or submit those 20+ data elements as you mentioned that faxing was not efficient?
Yeah, so as I said, there was some kind of a computer program or a company called Pioneer, and she worked with them to develop some kind of a spreadsheet that made it a little bit easier than what she had.
Pioneer RX?
Maybe. Is that?
I can say
That's
that
a pretty common pharmacy software service, so they probably generated the report for her within that. So all Pioneer users on this call out there, it might already be built for us.
I have heard that they have done something like that. So hopefully we can get them to post that as a regular report.
Yeah, that would be big because that's a really difficult aspect of this. It's for the nursing homes that are doing testing right now, that's their biggest hurdle. I mean, first of all, they've never done this type of testing before, but the reporting requirements have just, made them pull their hair out. It's been very hard.
well, with that, we're right at 9,
And Jenny, this might be some
just over time. Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I was there. There was just kind of one last question that Craig Ritchie had asked regarding, is there emergency authorization for pharmacists to perform rapid flu tests? I know that's been done for some time kind of in the pharmacy setting. Is that something that might need a CDTA to be able to do? Could you just quickly comment on that before we release the code?
Yeah, I'll quickly comment on that because for flu, because there is a treatment that's available, I think that most pharmacies, and especially in Washington State, they will do a CDTA so that they can then not only test for the flu, but also provide treatment if it's warranted. Different states are different though, because the other states you don't need to have a CDTA to do that, and some states you just couldn't do it at all. So every state's a little bit different. Jenny, do you have anything to add to that?
Well,
So she's probably setting up the next class, which is already over. I mean, for flu testing and stuff like that, though, you do have to be CLIA waived. I would assume those aren't going to fall under any of the emergency orders right now. So, as a pharmacy, you can do the flu tests unless you have a CDTA. You obviously can't do the treatments, but you do have to have the CLIA waiver in place to be able to do that.
Yeah, there's an insurance order that requires that the insurance companies pay for all the tests. So a lot of times people remember that there was a requirement to pay for flu and pay for strep testing and that early on, but there isn't a declaration that allows pharmacists to do all flu testing. And for some reason, I thought I had remembered something like that. I dove back through all the declarations and all of the different announcements and was not able to find any of that. So I don't believe there is any requirement there. You still need your CDTA for that. And as Carrie said, your CLIA waiver, there's great information for Washington pharmacists on the WSPA COVID-19 page about CLIA waivers and how to get them though.
Yeah, and you do need to have a CLIA waiver to do any of the point of care tests, even if it's COVID, you do need to get that CLIA waiver. But they're working with people to quickly get those CLIA waivers in place if you don't already have one.
So thank you so much, Sylvia and Andrew and Mike for hosting this session today.
Wonderful. Thanks, you guys. Have a great day.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Rest of the virtual meeting, everyone.